Mikhail Gorbachev's dreams of holding the Soviet Union together may have received a death blow today. The Union's three Slavic republics announced they are forming a separate Commonwealth of Independent States. Russia, the Ukraine, and Belarus control much of the Soviet Union's economic power, enough to challenge the rapidly fading strength of Gorbachev's central government. Details from Moscow correspondent John...
Hey, aren't you Russian?
Yeah?
So, were you born in Russia?
No.
But do you speak Russian?
I used to. When I was younger, sort of, I spoke it better. I can understand some of it now, but not really speak it.
But your family is from Russia, right?
Yeah, I was the first person to be born in America, but I also have Russian citizenship too, I think.
That's cool. So have you been there?
Yeah, something like 6 times to see my family. That was some imaginary conversation that represents the typical Q&A session that comes up when I mention I'm Russian. The thing is that, in truth, I'm not Russian at all. I was never born there, never lived there. I only have their citizenship and passport because of my parents, and I basically have forgotten the language. So, end of story. I'm Russian from my family origin, but I'm just American. I speak English, I study French in school, and hang out with my American friends. But I can't help but feel that there's a problem. I feel like there's something more to this than just identifying as American. The problem is that I can't communicate with some of my own family, and that's because over the years the language barrier between us keeps getting thicker and taller. I'm occasionally reminded of how it's better to be on the right side of this barrier, where I won't feel guilty about not retaining the language that my family has spoken for hundreds of years. Often my parents make a phone call to my mom's parents who are still living on the opposite side of the planet in Russia, in a city near Mongolia. I asked Mom about the latest Skype call she had with them one day while in the car, and my mom tells me what my grandma said when they started talking about me.
He knows English, he studies French, but can't say a word in Russian. Like few words which do not make us any closer. She said, I bet he speaks French million times better than Russian. What can I tell? It's true.
It's hard for me to personally understand how my grandparents feel, but I can only imagine the isolation they feel from me. Most people I know have very close relationships with their grandparents, who are often a couple hours' drive away, but for the few opportunities I have to even speak to them, I can't say anything more than hello and I'm doing fine. It may be my parents' fault in how they raised me, but that doesn't stop the guilty feeling I get sometimes. I remember one time at a wedding for one of the daughters of my parents' Russian friends, a woman who seemed to know me very well, but I couldn't remember at all, asked me how well I could speak Russian, and I tried my best to speak well, but she could see right through me and told me that it would be a shame if I lost the Russian language, and that I should become fluent now before college, where learning it would supposedly become more expensive. I'm reminded of the plenty of other kids I've seen who are children of immigrants from the former Soviet Union like me, but they're perfectly bilingual. Why aren't I? Is it such a bad thing? I turned to my sister for advice.
What would you think if I accepted that I can't and won't speak Russian? Should I make an honest, determined effort to relearn it, and would it be worth it? As far as I see it, obviously you have a very unique background and you have lots of resources to be able to dive into sort of your history and your family's history, and you could learn it, and you have lots of people who could help you with that. But I don't think that you necessarily should force yourself to do it until or unless you get a really strong interest for it. I don't think it's going to be interesting or worth it, as you say, if you sort of force yourself to do it because you feel like that's what you have to do.
So if right now I've decided that speaking Russian is not something I should pursue, at the expense of not being able to communicate with the Russian community, then that must mean that I shouldn't associate myself with being Russian at all. Still, that doesn't mean I haven't identified with being Russian before. Sometimes when I'm with my friends, I slip into a Russian accent, and I did this once for a prank call.
If you're not present, we will bring my friends from KGB. They will be in big black car.
When I do this, I stereotype Russians to the comedic viewpoint of an American, and I think this only serves to further dissociate myself from being Russian. This dives into another aspect of this issue, and that is of national identity. I've already said that I'm not Russian. I am 100% American in practice, but maybe I can find some closure by looking within the experiences of my family. As it turns out, being torn between two or more national identities isn't new. My great-grandfather lived in Kazakhstan in the Soviet Union and spoke Russian, but his family had to move to Ukraine, also in the Soviet Union. He was made fun of because as he tried to speak Ukrainian, he had a distinct Russian accent. He eventually mastered Ukrainian, but when his family moved back to Russia, he was again made fun of for having a Ukrainian accent when speaking Russian.
And he wasn't Ukrainian, but his relatives from his dad's side were. And he kind of always felt half Ukrainian, half Russian. Mm-hmm. Never knew exactly how to even introduce himself. Especially in Soviet Union times, it wasn't that important. You would write, in passport. I mean, Dim, how would you say? Was it important or wasn't important to know exact nationality? Because it was a line in a passport where you had to write who you are. And I think in his passport he was Russian. But he still felt very, very connected to Ukraine.
Coincidentally, my grandpa on my dad's side went through a nearly identical transformation. Except in this case, he was Ukrainian and wanted to get rid of his accent and any hint of his true origin when he spoke and identified as Russian. But of all people, my sister, Natalie, may have the most complicated background. She came with my parents when they left Russia to the United States, having to shift from being Russian to an American middle schooler and high schooler. As an undergraduate, she studied abroad in France and became fluent in French, then moved back to the U.S. for a few years until she started her graduate education in Oxford University in England, and now she lives in London and has traveled to Africa and Asia multiple times, utilizing the 3 languages she knows. Here's what she had to say about national identity when I asked her where it comes from.
So I think it's not a simple answer. I don't think it's only where you're born or only where you've been raised. Or where your parents are from. I think it's a mixture, and I think it basically depends on where the meaningful experiences of your life have come from. So if you traveled somewhere and you really associated with a place, I think that can be part of your identity as well. I think it's definitely a mixture of your experiences. So for somebody who's lived in the same place all of their life, it might just be their national identity is very strong to that one place where they were born and where they were raised. But if you're somebody who comes from a more diverse traveling and living background and you've lived in lots of different places, then your identity could be a mixture of things. And it's not necessarily a national identity, it almost becomes a bit of a global identity. And there are lots of people who kind of associate themselves as global citizens, who can't just identify with one nationality. And I think that's on the rise, and it's probably something that you're experiencing as well.
I think my sister's idea of being a global citizen is becoming more applicable with each day as the world gets smaller. All of these conflicts within my own family give me confidence that national identity and language and culture are not black and white labels. But going back to myself, if I can't speak Russian or be able to call myself a Russian, then the least I can do is be able to understand my family and Russia's history. This, I think, is the right approach, or compensation, if any, to not only being a part of my family but a member to global society. If you're listening to this and you maybe speak another language other than English, or have some family immigration history, or just struggle with your national identity, please let me know with some feedback, which is always appreciated.